What's going on, guys? Welcome to this new episode of the MetaRoy podcast. This is the show that makes learning about crypto simple and fun. I'm your host Roy, and every week on this show we talk in detail about one aspect of the crypto world. Today we are continuing on our journey from our previous episode towards understanding the story of Bitcoin. So if you have missed part 1, I urge you to go check that out so get some more background into Bitcoin. Also, if you are new to this show, follow me on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or whichever platform you're listening to me on. In return, I promise to have your back in anything and everything the world of crypto has to offer. Before we start though, just a quick disclaimer. I'm not a financial advisor and none of the following content is financial advice. So please do your own due diligence before making any moves in the crypto space. Also, as you may have seen by now, the world of crypto moves at light speed. So what I'm about to tell you is my view of the world, and I know many of you are going to listen to this in the future. So by the time you listen to it, a lot of things might have been different, but that's okay. So, are you strapped in for a fun ride on the Bitcoin roller coaster? So let's dig in. Last time around, we were talking about the cypherpunks and some early attempts such as DigiCash, Hashcash, B-Money, BitGold, etc. How they have tried and failed to create a reliable and secure digital currency free from a third party. So yes, Bitcoin first appeared in 2008, 3 years after BitGold, which was 2005. But before Bitcoin appeared, something else happened. Remember the 2008 crash? Yep. Basically 2008, for anyone who either wasn't paying attention or wasn't born, the whole financial system almost went down the toilet. It was chaos and we are still dealing with the fallout from it. But it's pretty easy to know where most of the blame for the financial crisis lies. The blame for the financial crash can largely be put at the feet of the banks. So it's really important to consider Bitcoin in the context of what happened in 2008 and also what the cypherpunks had been talking about long before that. The fact that we couldn't trust these large entities. The computer age had ushered in this whole new era, and there were massive risks associated with it. And these risks came to pass in 2008 because these institutions that were supposedly looking after our money had been gambling with it instead. And you could not trust them anymore, especially when they were bailed out and no one was punished. Trust was just completely eroded. Governments seemed to be colluding in this as well, because they were acting in the interests of the bank rather than in the interests of the people. And this only confirmed the kind of libertarian views that the cypherpunks had. So that's a really important context on what happened next, which contributed to the emergence of Bitcoin. Anyway, one day in August 2008, Adam Back got an email from someone he had never heard of before. This mysterious person's name was Satoshi Nakamoto. So in his email, Satoshi basically asked Adam to have a look for a proposal for something that Nakamoto was developing, something called Bitcoin. So Adam had a brief look at it and he took the time. When he replied to Satoshi, he reminded him of all the other experiments with digital cash that had been tried by him and others. And I think he mentioned VDAI and Nick Szabo. A couple of months later, on the 31st of October 2008, just 10 days after the Fed had loaned out $540 billion. Yes, that is a B. $540 billion in order to keep the US economy going. Just 10 days after this incident, Satoshi reappeared and published the Bitcoin white paper to the cypherpunks mailing list. And this was the beginning of cryptocurrency. The white paper was titled Bitcoin, a peer-to-peer electronic cash system. And here's the opening line. A purely peer-to-peer version of electronic cash would allow online payments to be sent directly from one party to another without going through a financial institution. That's the elevator pitch. Now, not many people believed in him in the first place and the topic went lull for a bit. Satoshi then fired up the Bitcoin software kind of around New Year 2009. Kind of undaunted by this sort of deafening silence. And he mined the first block that is now known as the Genesis block. Another really big moment in the history of cryptocurrency. And he received the first 50 Bitcoins as a block reward. Now, if you don't know what a block reward is, we have actually discussed this in the episode about blockchain. But essentially, a block reward is something that is given as a reward or an incentive to miners for maintaining the network or for validating the transactions correctly. So this Genesis block contained a message. The message read, "The Times, 3rd January 2009, Chancellor on the brink of second bailout for banks." And that to me is an unmistakable pointer to the fact that we have been building up to this cataclysm, this 2008 crisis for years. This was a reaction to what these guys had done. Satoshi obviously mined the first block. He was the first node on the Bitcoin network. And then he announced on the cryptography mailing list that Bitcoin was live. There was a pretty lukewarm response. Now this leads me to one of my favorite quotations of all time. And this is Satoshi writing on the cryptography mailing list saying it might make sense just to get some in case it catches on. He was obviously referring to getting some Bitcoin. Well, the only person to respond positively was Hal Finney. Remember, I told you he was important? He asked to see the actual code. He was interested enough. He was like, okay, let me see what this is made of. So Satoshi sent it to him and they began working on it together. They would make tweaks and they'd test it out and they'd send each other emails. And Hal Finney became node number 2 on the network. And he also mined a few blocks. And then Satoshi tested the network by sending Hal 10 Bitcoins, 10 BTC. So essentially Hal was the first person ever to have received a Bitcoin payment. Now the first few versions of the Bitcoin software, they basically kept crashing. It was full of bugs. There was one problem after another, and by this time, Hal has basically already mined several blocks as well. But after a week, he became worried that all the work his computer was doing to mine these blocks was actually causing damage to it. Because, as you know, Bitcoin mining can be quite processor heavy. It requires the computer to do a lot of work guessing these numbers. And the fan on Hal Finney's computer was constantly running to keep it cool. And the noise of the fan was irritating him. So he switched it off. So it's not exactly the best start to this beautiful new technology. Node number 2 tries it out for a bit and this is quite annoying. The first few days, the first few weeks of Bitcoin was basically about Satoshi and Hal Finney collaborating on tweaking this software and trying to get this system to work, ironing out the bugs as they came along. And it's worth pointing out again at this point that nobody actually knew who Satoshi was. And that is still to this day. So, moving on. Satoshi stuck around cryptography forums and an incipient Bitcoin message board, responding with excitement to anyone who expressed interest in Bitcoin. But it was almost no one who was there. It was at this point that the technology got its savior from an unlikely place. A college student called Martti Malmi from Finland. When Martti Malmi found Bitcoin in the spring of 2009, he was in his second year at Helsinki University of Technology. Martti's reclusive, computer-centric life led him to the ideas behind Bitcoin and ultimately to Bitcoin itself. He wrote to Satoshi expressing interest in helping with Bitcoin. He set up an online forum where the small but growing group of people attracted to the technology could communicate to each other. The Bitcoin forum went online in the fall of 2009, and it soon started attracting a few regulars. One of them, who called himself New Liberty Standard, talked about the need for a website where people could buy and sell bitcoins for real money. And Martti had been talking with Satoshi about something similar, but he was eager to help New Liberty Standard. In the very first recorded transaction of Bitcoin for US dollars, Martti sent New Liberty Standards 5,050 bitcoins to use for seeding the new exchange. In return, guess how much Martti got? Well, Martti just got $5.02 by PayPal. But Martti was instrumental in helping publicize Bitcoin. He created bitcoin.org, he came up with the logo, he collaborated with Satoshi, making Bitcoin much more accessible. He was also heavily involved with submitting material about Bitcoin for an article published on a site called Slashdot in July 2010. Now, Slashdot is basically a kind of tech website. This really helped to supercharge interest in the project, and it started attracting a load of new users. The work that Marty did in collaboration with Satoshi was vital to help Bitcoin get off the ground. With the early days of Bitcoin, essentially, in his own words, Marty set in motion something greater than personal gain. So yeah, people like Hal and Marty selflessly contributed to Bitcoin in its early days. So there are plenty more people who have contributed tons to Bitcoin, and I should say this at this point because we are constrained by time and because the Bitcoin story is so engaging and so ongoing. These guys that we are going to talk about aren't the only people who contributed to Bitcoin, obviously, but they are among the most important. But there are many others, and if I haven't mentioned their names, my apologies. It's just in the name of keeping things concise. I think the most earliest famous story that I remember reading myself is one of the most important contributors to Bitcoin as well. His name was Laszlo Haniaks, and he is commonly known as the Bitcoin pizza guy. I'm sure you remember him. Well, in 2010, Haniaks spent 10,000 Bitcoins at a local pizza restaurant called Papa John's to buy himself 2 pizzas. And this transaction is actually known as the first official use of Bitcoin for a commercial transaction with an actual company. Back then, his Bitcoins were worth only $40. But since cryptocurrency wasn't a thing in the commercial world, Haniaks reached out to the Bitcoin Talk community and openly traded his Bitcoins to anyone who would buy him these pizzas. Considering Bitcoin's value today, these 2 pizzas can be regarded as the costliest pizzas of all time. So initially, Bitcoin mining using the processor was a slow process. But it was actually Haniaks who used the graphics card to get a lot more processing power. Essentially a lot more mining done. That was the technological leap. A good analogy is if everybody else was mining with shovels, suddenly Haniaks appeared with an excavator. In addition, he also contributed a lot towards making the Bitcoin protocol more secure and free from vulnerabilities. Now, Satoshi may be hailed as the mastermind behind Bitcoin, but there is a man who really made Bitcoin into what it is today, and his name is Gavin Andresen. In 2010, Gavin Andresen came up with a novel idea called the Bitcoin faucet. Imagine, to get some Bitcoin, all the visitor had to do was go to the Bitcoin faucet website, complete a CAPTCHA, and he used to get 5 BTC for free. The thinking behind this project was that the only way to turn Bitcoin from a small idea and community into a worldwide phenomenon was to ensure that the cryptocurrency reached a wide audience that could make use of it. And it worked. Since its inception to its closure in 2012, more than 19,700 BTC was dispersed among the website's visitors, and the currency was slowly gaining traction with the first ever price spike in the history of Bitcoin happening in 2013. Now, something as novel as Bitcoin did not come into public usage as easily as you may have thought. Bitcoin had to jump multiple hurdles. There were multiple attacks to the protocol, fake businesses, scams done to extract money from Bitcoin users and whatnot. For example, on 15th August 2010, a vulnerability in the Bitcoin protocol was exploited and 184 million BTC were fraudulently created. Remember that the protocol limit is only 21 million BTC. Obviously, the transaction does not succeed and it is removed from the blockchain, but it is one of the very few breaches, the sort of few vulnerabilities that happened in the earliest days of Bitcoin. This was a big moment in that the code looked vulnerable, but they were able to fix it. But the biggest Bitcoin heist was probably the Mt. Gox debacle, where 740,000 Bitcoin were stolen from its users. At its peaks, the Mt. Gox exchange was handling a whopping 70% of all Bitcoin transactions worldwide. Over the course of several years, the hackers were able to slowly drain coins out of Mt. Gox's hot wallet, and they just never picked up on it. In fact, the amount of Bitcoin they had lost was about 7% of all Bitcoin in circulation. But here's the thing. Many people mistakenly saw the whole Mt. Gox thing as a weakness of Bitcoin. Now, this is not the case. Bitcoin itself has never been hacked, and there was no flaw in the Bitcoin protocol. What it did show was the whole thing was in danger of trusting centralized entities, which ironically was the point of Bitcoin in the first place. So in a weird way, in a weird, horrible and traumatizing way, Mt. Gox kind of made Bitcoin's point that decentralization was the way to go. Another dark moment in Bitcoin's history was the Silk Road. Essentially, it was an online black marketplace where buyers and sellers of illegal or unethical items could transact anonymously. Utilizing privacy techniques such as the Tor network and cryptocurrency transactions, people were able to transact in drugs, hacked passwords, illegal data, and other contraband items. So it's fair to say that Mt. Gox and Silk Road both played a huge role in bringing Bitcoin into wider public consciousness. But unfortunately, both also contributed to the perception that it was a scam, incredibly risky, or only used by criminals. And as I have said before, I think a lot of people still hold these views today. So it is basically an image, a perception problem that Bitcoin is still trying to shake to an extent with some people. Anyway, Silk Road was shut down in October 2013 and Mt. Gox collapsed in early 2014. It kind of happened vaguely around the same time. Not a great time for Bitcoin. But a few other notable events had taken place prior to all this, and a few worth mentioning. In June 2012, we had the founding of Coinbase. Now I think it's probably fair to say that anyone who has ever heard of crypto probably has heard of Coinbase as well. It's now one of the biggest exchanges out there, and it has aimed to make it safer and easier to buy Bitcoin. And yeah, as we can see, it has been around for 10 years now. It is impressive. And obviously since then it has gone on to become the first ever crypto exchange to go public in 2021. Then on 12th March 2013, the Bitcoin blockchain split into two for a few hours. This was the result of a network upgrade that went wrong. What happened was, it split into and started mining kind of in parallel. Fortunately, the developers working on Bitcoin were able to fix it fairly quickly. And I think what this shows is that then, as now, really Bitcoin was a work in progress. It's not by any means finished or complete. There are still additions, there are still improvements, little tweaks being made to Bitcoin network even today. In April of 2013, the Bitcoin price crossed $100 for the first time. And it was also around this time that the Winklevoss twins discovered Bitcoin. They got really into it and began buying up a lot of BTC. And they used the money from their Facebook payout to do it. So in a way, Mark Zuckerberg actually financed Bitcoin. Anyway, the Winklevoss twins, they recognized the importance of Bitcoin and they went around. They bought up a fairly credible percentage at least of the actual Bitcoin in existence. And the Winklevoss twins had become pretty big players in crypto. There's an exchange that they founded called Gemini, obviously twins, my sun sign as well. And they were some of the first of the mainstream finance types to actually recognize Bitcoin's potential. There's a great book which I should mention at this point called Bitcoin Billionaires. It talks all about the Winklevoss twins and the discovery of Bitcoin. I think you should really read it. It's a great read. Anyway, around this time, Bitcoin was starting to be talked about by celebrities and politicians as well. Bill Gates and Warren Buffett, they both discussed it on TV. These titans, if you like, of business and finance are talking about Bitcoin on TV. It's come a long way since then, since just being kicked about by the cypherpunks on the internet's cryptographic mailing list. Another huge moment is in November 2013. Jennifer Calvary, who worked at the US Treasury Department and the FinCEN, the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, she talked positively about Bitcoin during a hearing of the Senate Banking Committee. So yeah, there were plenty of detractors, but other people were starting to take notice of it, and they realized that it was the real deal. Back in 2013, 2014, that sort of time, China was also becoming a big market for Bitcoin. And actually, most of the Bitcoin mining was beginning to happen in China. In November 2013, the Chinese government is reported to have allowed Chinese citizens to actually trade Bitcoin. So remember, while all of these events are taking place and while all of these big names are kind of discovering it, actual Bitcoin adoption is kind of chugging along in the background. More people are buying it, more people are using it, we've got businesses beginning to accept it. It's slowly but surely taking off. And obviously, as adoption continues, the price continues to rise. Now, even with these amazing qualities that Bitcoin has, it does present something of a drawback because it is very difficult to actually do anything to upgrade it. So if you like the Bitcoin network, if you think there's an improvement to be made, if there's a patch to be implemented or anything like that, doing it is actually quite tricky because of this decentralization, because there is no one person in charge. So there has to be a majority of miners and developers on the network agreeing to implement any changes. Now, this doesn't mean that it's impossible to change Bitcoin, to make adjustments to the code. We actually had one fairly recently. I think it was called Taproot. It was November 2020. It was fairly small, but it was actually a big moment because it made changes to the actual Bitcoin software, the Bitcoin protocol. And this is, as I say, very difficult to do. Because of this, it's kind of tied into this. It's actually also very difficult to build any applications on top of Bitcoin. As a network for exchanging value, as a digital currency, Bitcoin does its job very well. But actually doing anything else with it, actually building anything that can run on top of the Bitcoin network is also very difficult. For the same reasons, the decentralization. And this is why Ethereum was actually created by Vitalik Buterin. He was frustrated. He loved Bitcoin. He wrote about it. He was a big disciple of it. But he saw the limitations early on. And that's what he set out to do with Ethereum. In the next episode, we will talk about Ethereum in general. But for now, these difficulties, these challenges for upgrading Bitcoin ultimately led to one of the most notorious and difficult episodes in Bitcoin's history. We are obviously talking about the Bitcoin block wars. So 2015 and 2016 were, as by Bitcoin standards, fairly uneventful. Adoption itself continued, more merchants carried on accepting it, big names, Microsoft, Dell, Expedia, they all began accepting Bitcoin. It wasn't like nothing was going on. And we also had this explosion in the number of Bitcoin ATMs. They were kind of springing up all over the place. In October 2015, the European Union ruled that Bitcoin to be actually a currency in Europe, which meant that EU citizens didn't have to pay tax on trading it. Quite big a moment. But the notorious episode that I was talking about was the block size wars. Let's have a bit of context first about the block size wars. So as you already know, Bitcoin transactions very simply are grouped into blocks. And these blocks are then added to the Bitcoin blockchain and the whole network chugs along. Bitcoin is designed so that a new block is produced on an average every 10 minutes. And the Bitcoin protocol dictates this. You can't just pile more computing power, more hash power onto the Bitcoin network and produce blocks faster. Because if this happens, the network adjusts the difficulty of the mining to keep that 10-minute average. So you can't cheat it in any way. Now each block also has a size limit. It can only contain so much data. And the size limit on the Bitcoin blockchain is 1 megabyte. So this is basically a whole load of numbers. It's not like they're trying to put heavy files like video or audio stuff in there. So 1 MB can actually record a lot of transaction history, a lot of letters and numbers, but it's still fairly limited. It can only store a certain amount, which is 1 MB of transaction data. So as a result of this 1 MB limit, the Bitcoin network can only process somewhere between 3 and 7 transactions per second. Now this is not very much, especially if you compare it to the likes of the Visa network, which can process about 65,000 transactions per second. And actually most other cryptos today leave that in the dust as well. Anyhow, it means that Bitcoin transactions can often take a long time to go through. You pay with Bitcoin for things and it's not instantaneous. If it's something for quite large an amount, it's nerve-wracking. For 10 minutes you're waiting there. Did I do it right? Did I put the right code in it? Is the address right? Because obviously Bitcoin transactions can't be reversed once it is on the blockchain. When I send crypto today, and especially Bitcoin, even though I know why it's taking its time, it's still kind of like I won't be able to relax until I get the notification from the wallet that I'm sending it to that it has arrived safely. So obviously this is not ideal for a payment network. But also this can make transaction fees on the Bitcoin network much more expensive as well. Because some network users will be willing to pay more to have their transactions processed quicker. So if people started bidding up on their transaction fees, it increases for everyone because the average price goes up. Now, if you remember, miners who process these transactions on the Bitcoin network are incentivized to do the mining and expend all that computing power, firstly by block rewards, as you remember, and secondly by transaction fees. So you get this allocation of BTC, of Bitcoins, when you mine a block, which obviously today is pretty valuable, but the other way that miners make their money is by charging a small fee to include a transaction in a block. And it's not usually very much. It's probably a fraction of a penny or so when the network is all working fine. But when the network gets congested, and this is even more so on other networks like Ethereum, these transaction fees can get obscenely high. Sometimes on Ethereum today, sometimes the actual gas fees, as they call it, can be more than what you're sending. Let's say you're trying to send $100 worth of Ethereum. The gas fees itself could be $120. That is ridiculous. And this is one of the big problems with Ethereum at the moment, which obviously it is working hard to fix. But I should say that this is something that most crypto networks experience. And this was a problem with Bitcoin. And in a way, it still is, because as we are going to see, not much has changed. So the network itself is not very fast. It is only able to deal with a few transactions per second. So concerns around this block size, around this 1 MB block size limit, had been rumbling for a while. And actually in 2015, Gavin Andresen proposed increasing the block size to 20 MB. Now this did not go well with the Bitcoin community. You're probably asking yourself why. What's wrong with increasing the block size? Speed it up, speed the network up. That's great. But the main problem with this is that as you increase the block size, then the size of the Bitcoin blockchain itself would get much larger. You'd be dealing with much larger amounts of data. And as a result of this, it would become much harder for smaller nodes to store a copy of the Bitcoin blockchain. Now remember, you have got miners on the Bitcoin network who are processing transactions, minting these blocks and getting paid for their troubles. But you also have these smaller nodes, which are often just a very, very basic little computer. And all they do is store copies of the blockchain and validate transactions. So they just check that these transactions have gone through, that the balances of the people sending and receiving are up to date, all this sort of stuff. They are doing fairly basic low-level computing, but they still need to store this data. Now if you suddenly increase this block size and ask them to store a much larger amount of data, fewer and fewer nodes will actually have the capacity to do it. And what that means is that you have to reduce the decentralization of the network, because smaller networks start to drop off. And at the same time, more power gets handed to larger nodes and larger entities, in particular miners. So it's bad overall for decentralization. And if decentralization decreases, so does security. So this was essentially the big objection to larger blocks. And I remember when I first read about this problem, and not knowing as much as I do now, I was thinking, well, yeah, make the blocks bigger, the whole network becomes quicker, more people can use it. But actually this question of decentralization, this idea of making the network too big, is a real issue. For example, as I mentioned earlier, most of the Bitcoin mining was done in China. They dominated the hash rate. And the worry was that the Chinese miners would become too powerful if the blockchain got bigger and harder to store. These Chinese miners would occupy an even greater percentage of the network. Now, theoretically, if this happened, they could manipulate the network. This was a big problem and a big concern. And there was also a concern that bigger blocks would actually reduce transaction fees. Now, again, on the face of it, why is there a problem about it? Because there is no incentive then for the miners. Miners need these transaction fees to incentivize them to maintain the network. So if the transaction fees are going down, the smaller miners will drop off, because what happens when the last block is mined? Then the transaction fees has to go up to keep the network going. There has been some debate over this because we are quite a long way away from the last block being mined, probably decades away. But a lot of people are thinking about this already. What happens when the block reward does not exist anymore? And I mean, obviously transaction fees will how miners will make their money in the future. But in order to make it worthwhile for lots of miners, which is what you want, then people are pointing out that transaction fees will have to go up a lot in order to cover their expenses. It's hard to know exactly what will happen at that time. I mean, you can't predict the future because the block reward is going to decrease ever more so. At the moment, I think it's about 6.25 Bitcoin and it decreases roughly every 4 years. So in about 2 years, it's going to decrease further to 3.125 BTC. And yes, this is going to be a problem. The block size debate though has kind of gone away because these scalability issues are being addressed in other ways. Perhaps the most notable of this is the Lightning Network. In a nutshell, the Lightning Network is looking to settle Bitcoin transactions off the main Bitcoin blockchain. They settle the Bitcoin blockchains on the Lightning Network first and then validate them on the main chain later on. Quite similar to what Polygon is doing on Ethereum. They are often known as layer 2 scaling solutions or sidechain solutions. And that is what is being explored right now in order to solve this problem of the Bitcoin blockchain, which is essentially so slow and clunky. So the big blocks ideas has been consigned to history, but not before it managed to do a lot of damage to the Bitcoin community. There were multiple hard forks which happened. Bitcoin blockchain was split into multiple different blockchains, and this is something we still live with today. By this point, there have been so many events that have happened around Bitcoin. So many important moments, important people. And I think we have discussed the big ones until now. Let's look at some more of the milestones in Bitcoin's history. Now, 2017, if you remember, was a wild year for crypto. We saw what was known as the ICO boom, the initial coin offering boom. A lot of startup crypto projects realized that they had this amazing way of earning startup capital. They basically held coin sales, they issued a coin or token, they sold it in the ICO, and some of them raked in absolutely obscene amounts of money. The world in 2017 basically just went crypto crazy, and altcoins, for the first time ever, shared the limelight with Bitcoin. The Bitcoin price peaked just shy of $20,000 late in December 2017. And we later found out this was the very top of the market. This is the time around when institutional investors started getting interested, they started getting involved more, but things got a little painful, didn't they? Early January 2018, which is what we refer now as crypto winter, set in. Prices absolutely tanked, and it was tough. So when this crypto winter set in early January 2018, that is when kind of mainstream criticism of Bitcoin seemed to bubble up. People like Warren Buffett called it rat poison squared, and it got worse. Because in February 2018, the Chinese government announced a ban on crypto exchanges. Fair to say that 2018 was a tough year, both for Bitcoin and crypto in general. And a lot of people felt that the whole thing was a bubble that had just burst. A lot of these initial coin offerings failed. Bitcoin price dropped to as low as $3,200. So 2018 is generally a year people in crypto like to forget about. We don't like to think about it too much. 2019 also was kind of slow, although Bitcoin was starting to climb up. But March 2020 came and Bitcoin absolutely tanked again. But this time, along with everything else, the stock market tanked, the Bitcoin price tanked, all cryptos tanked. And this was based on the announcement of COVID-19 from the World Health Organization. We were officially in a pandemic. But things didn't stay brutal for long because May 2020 was a really important date. That was the last Bitcoin halving. That is when the block reward for mining a Bitcoin block got cut down from 12.5 BTC to 6.25 BTC by the algorithm. And in this case, the prices of Bitcoin and other cryptos started creeping slowly back up. crypto was basically becoming new again because we all were suddenly inside, locked in our houses with not a lot of things to do. So interest in crypto went through the roof. People were like, you know what? I'm going to look into crypto. I haven't had the time to explore it all this while, but I'm going to see what this is all about. So people were educating themselves and retail interest started picking up during the pandemic. While retail investors picked up during the pandemic, the big money was being poured into Bitcoin and crypto in general by late 2020 and early 2021. In October of 2020, PayPal announced that it was going into crypto and it was going to allow users to actually buy and sell various cryptos through its app. This was a huge step towards mainstream adoption. You had all sorts of big names, big investors, big wolves of Wall Street started to make encouraging noises about Bitcoin again. In 2021, Tesla, for example, announced that it was going to accept BTC for its cars. Elon Musk started tweeting his support for Bitcoin. So in March 2021, the Bitcoin market cap hit $1 trillion for the first time. You had investment banks, the likes of JP Morgan, who had been very rude about crypto up to that point. Suddenly they were offering Bitcoin exposures to their clients because their clients were all going, hey, why can't we get involved? This is amazing. But then again, in May 2021, crypto crashed because Tesla announced that it was suspending its Bitcoin payments over concerns about the environmental impact of Bitcoin mining. These ESG, environmental, social and governance investing guidelines were all the rage at that moment. So Tesla stopped accepting Bitcoin payments and the markets didn't react very well to this. And we saw what was known as a flash crash. It dipped very quickly and it was a nasty couple of months. But you could not keep Bitcoin down because in 2021 there was more good news. Germany decided to allow its financial institutions to hold up to 20% of their assets in Bitcoin. And what had been sort of an outlawed sector just a few years back, even the German banks started piling in big money into it. Then obviously, as we know, we had the Bitcoin Miami conference with the president of El Salvador, Nayib Bukele, announcing that his country will accept Bitcoin as legal tender. And all of this came into effect a few months later in September 2021. Of probably all the recent developments in Bitcoin, this has to be the biggest really. But just in relation to everything that had gone before, even just a few years ago, in the depths of the crypto winter in 2018, if you had said in about 3 years' time that there will be a country accepting Bitcoin as legal tender, you wouldn't have got a very receptive audience. You would have been laughed out of town by all. But El Salvador's decision was just impossible to imagine. And I'm sure El Salvador is not going to be the last country to accept Bitcoin. There are going to be many more countries adopting this as legal tender. A few more noteworthy things happened around September 2021. We saw China banning crypto mining. Even though it had banned exchanges a long time ago, it was still possible to mine Bitcoin and other cryptos in China, but no more after September 2021. And all that happened was most of Bitcoin's hash rate moved outside of China. So I think China really shot itself in the foot there. They cited sort of things like environmental concerns really. But the reality was China wanted to launch its own CBDC, central bank digital currency, which is similar to cryptocurrency in some ways, but nothing in fact like a cryptocurrency at all. But obviously China didn't want an autonomous form of money challenging its own central bank. In October 2021, we had the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission in the US, approving the first ever American Bitcoin futures ETF. And with all this history around it, the Bitcoin story is just getting started. That's one of the things that is so exciting about it. It's only 13 years old, but it's evolving all the time, it's growing all the time, there's so much more ahead of it, and at the moment, it's matured greatly. Bitcoin has survived indifference, scandals, disasters, attempts to ban it. It has survived divisions within its community. It has survived hard forks and price crashes and pandemics and wars. It has survived Elon Musk. And it is surviving global uncertainty at that moment, just at 13 years of age. Just imagine what it is going to be like in the future. The Sweet 16 part of it is going to be great. Bitcoin can't be killed. It can't be stopped. It's only going to get stronger as the years go by. And yes, Bitcoin is now digital gold. And that is all I have for you today, folks. In the next episode, we are going to journey deeper into the wider world of crypto because there is so much more to crypto than just Bitcoin. The next one is going to be even more fun because we will explore the story of Ethereum. I hope you've enjoyed this second part of the two-part episode about the story of Bitcoin. I would love to hear what you thought about this episode. So drop me a comment or a review on my website, themetaroy.com, or leave me a message or comment through Twitter or Instagram @themetaroy. And do stay in touch, for the next episodes are going to be even more interesting. Do follow this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you like listening your podcast to. Bye bye for now and have a great rest of the week ahead.